kind, and thank you to all of you for joining us this evening. It's nice to see a couple of familiar, friendly faces as well out there, which kind of makes my heart warm. So thank you. Now, I don't know what people are expecting this evening, but I'm going to do the one thing that I know I'm pretty good at, which is talking about myself. So I'm kind of pleased about that. I was asked to come and talk a bit about the blog that I've been writing for the last 3 years, which is called Awkward Demographic, and I'll explain a little bit about that in a minute and how that came about. I started writing the blog because I only found out 3 years ago that I am autistic, and at the age of 47, that was quite a shock, I suppose, to the system, to find out something that I think now is really quite important about who I am and how I've lived my life and the way that I do things and respond to things. So it was a pretty big deal, I guess. And I started writing the blog because I didn't really know what to do with this information when I was first told. It was the 6th of December 2017, and I'd had this 2-hour assessment, and she said, "How do you feel about it?" And I thought, wow, that's a really big question to ask somebody. How do you feel when you've just been told at the age of 47 that you're autistic? And I said, I don't really know. I had lots of different feelings running through me at that moment in time, some really good ones and some really uncertain, unsure ones. And I went away and I didn't know what to do with it all. It was difficult to sleep with that much information going through my brain, thinking about everything, trying to make things fit, and some things did and some things didn't. And so I felt the best thing I could do was write it down. And as I was writing it down and it was making me feel a lot better and I was slowly starting to talk to people, I realized that actually I could just put it onto a blog and then it was out there, and if it helped somebody else, then that would be a good thing. Kind of that's what's happened with the blog. The other thing about the blog, and I noticed this on the weekend, I decided that I'd have another good look at the blog before I did this talk. So I printed it all off, and I realized that over the time that I've been writing it, I've written something in the region of just over 21,500 words, which is quite a lot of words. And if somebody said to me, sit down and write over 20,000 words about your autism, I would just be like, no, I couldn't do that. They're not there, but they are. And the other interesting thing about it is looking back at how my kind of approach to being autistic has changed over that time, the language that I've used, the things that I guess I've learned about myself since the beginning of it. And I'm not going to read each of the blogs because the blog is out there and I will show you all where to find it if you want to have a look at it afterwards. But I'm going to pick up some bits from it that I've kind of highlighted as I've had a look at it. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about before I got my diagnosis. And the one thing I'll say is that I always knew that I was different, and that's not different good or different bad, just different, that I didn't think about things and see things in the same way that everybody else did. I just always knew that. I have probably since I was in my late teens, maybe even a bit sooner than that, carried out certain acts, ways of being that I've since discovered are quite common amongst autistic people, things like masking and stimming and other things, which I talk a little bit more about in a bit. So there are some of those things that were always there that I knew, I just didn't have a word for them. And sometimes when I did things in different ways, people would tell me that, you know, they weren't good, that I was a bad person. And you start to believe that after a while when people tell you these things over and over. So actually to go and have a diagnosis and find out that it's something else was kind of part of a relief around it. The first thing that a lot of people ask me, especially other adults who think there's a possibility that they might be autistic, is, you know, what did you do? How did you go about doing it? So I thought, because I don't know exactly who is sat here in front of me, that I would just go over that with you. Essentially what happened was I was sat talking to a friend of mine, Greg, and I know Greg won't mind me saying that it was Greg, having a conversation because he not that long before had a diagnosis himself in his mid-20s to say that he was autistic. And we were talking about some things, and I found out a bit more about it because I wanted to support my friend. And he said to me one day, you should do the test, and laughed. And this is a kind of Greg thing. So everything's kind of a bit jokey. So I just thought he was being a little bit rude and a little bit jokey with me. So I was like, yeah, haha, Greg, great. Anyway, a few weeks later or a couple of months later, we were sat down again having a chat, and he went, you should do this test. I mean, really do it now. And I was like, okay. And so he showed me where the AQ test was online, and sat there and looked at me smiling as I went through the whole test and did it. And at the end, he went, go on then, what does it say? I said, I think you know what it says, don't you? And he just started laughing because he knew that I was going to get quite a high score, and I did. The score wasn't borderline or low. It was well into there's a high likelihood that you are autistic. Gave me quite a lot of food for thought. I actually really believed, and this is kind of shows to some extent my naivety around autism back then, that I had picked up on some of Greg's autism, and that was why I'd got a high score on that test. Really, really stupid. So he went away and I did the test again about a week later, and the score came out the same. And I thought, no, that's just because I'm not feeling too great about it. And that's had an effect on the test. So I left it about a month to 6 weeks, and I did the test again and it came out the same. And I did it again one more time for luck, and it still came out high. At which point I'd actually started to read a little bit more about autism and thought, you know, there are some things that fit, but there are some things that don't particularly. And anyway, in my mind, I didn't look like what I thought the way that the media portray autistic people. So I didn't look, not that autistic people look like anything, but back then I didn't think I looked like what autism was, because there was just, I guess, not enough out there that fitted me as an adult. So I made an appointment to see my doctor, and I sat there and I talked to them, and I talked them through the fact that I'd done all these tests, and I talked about a few of the traits I felt possibly could be leading me towards possibly being autistic. And I was very clear, I'd thought it through, and I knew what I needed to sort of say to her. And she looked at me and said, after talking for nearly half an hour, yes, you could be autistic, but why do you need to do this? You're clearly really high functioning. You've got a job, you've got a family, you've got a home. You know, what do you need a diagnosis for? And that was the moment that I actually broke down in that conversation. And I asked her, what does high functioning look like? Does it look like somebody who gets in from work at 4:15, curls up in a ball on the sofa and can't move for the next 3 hours? Or goes and finds a dark space, shuts all the curtains, and is just in tears because they're completely exhausted by the day that they've just had? Or sometimes just actually can't get as far as work because they can't cope with the thought of everything that's coming at them, or can't cope in certain situations, or starts to pass out when they're going into train stations and things because everything becomes a bit too much. And she agreed to send me for an assessment. Only at that point in time, she said to me, I would, but we don't have services to assess adults in this city. And it was really lucky that I'd had that chat with Greg beforehand, because he said, yeah, we do, and wrote them down for me. And so I was very well armed at that point in time. And so I was sent for an assessment. I was with the assessor for 2 hours, and she just looked at me and said, I've been doing this for 30 years. And without doubt, you know, there's no doubt in my mind. She said, use the word Asperger's. She said, you have Asperger's, you're autistic. But wanted me to have a second assessment, not because she had any doubt about the assessment diagnosis she'd given me, but because she thought there were probably other things as well that might need to be looked at. So I did have to go back and have a follow-up with a clinical psychologist and a speech and language therapist who also agreed with her 100%. And yeah, the 6th of December, so that was a day it all kind of changed, I suppose, and things became different for me from there on in. I kind of want to talk a little bit about what does having a diagnosis mean, because it's a tricky one. It doesn't suddenly mean that everything is better or worse or different or anything. It's not a magic wand. Having that, I did so much reading, and a really great book that I read was called Odd Girl Out by Laura James, and I've really related to that book. And at the end of it, she talked about finding communities online, particularly on Facebook, of other adults that are autistic that she could connect to. And I did that, and it was really not for me. So I think the reason it wasn't for me was because what I found in those communities were lots of people who were desperate for a diagnosis, who thought that it would just make everything better. But I'm not going to lie about things and make things up. It doesn't make everything better. It makes things different. Some situations can become better, some not necessarily. Knowing that certain things trigger me, that certain things make me feel differently, like noise and lights and sounds, and the way my clothes always feel like there's a little army of ants running around inside of them all. Knowing all those things are because I'm autistic and not just because I'm really difficult and fussy about stuff, that's made life a bit better. But there are, I guess, there's a lot of things that aren't and that will never change. And I'll talk a little bit about that in regards to how people have responded to it a bit, I guess. The first main question people ask me is, why did I get tested? What difference did I think it would make? And the honest thing I can say about that is I did go and do that test, but I didn't think I was autistic. I genuinely didn't believe that. I'd prepared myself for a borderline personality disorder diagnosis, because that's what I had been told to prepare myself for, because that was a diagnosis most females are given at any point in time. So, and also because I suppose I'd done a lot of reading at that point, and actually autism made a lot of sense to me, and it would make a lot of things not actually be my fault anymore, because I wasn't doing things on purpose to be difficult or, you know, making life hard for people deliberately. It's just, that's the way my brain works. So that was kind of really why it was to know, it was to have that knowledge. It wasn't because I thought there was a magic wand about it. The how I've already kind of shared with you, and that is a question that lots of people ask. There's just not enough information out there for adults who may well be autistic and, you know, could benefit from having some further support around it. The bigger one, I suppose, is the what. What does it mean? What does having that diagnosis really mean now? It means, really importantly for me, that I know that I am not a bad person. Some of the behaviour that I've exhibited over the years, I suppose, has been labelled bad by people. A really lovely thing that was said to me once by a colleague who I still work with was that it's not that I'm difficult, it's that I'm an awkward demographic. And this was before they knew I was autistic. I'm an awkward demographic. And because of that, I'm also quite robust in the way that I deal with things and approach things. And that was good, because it could help influence change and stop things getting stuck in a kind of, you know, cycle of never moving forward. And that's probably the nicest way anyone's ever described my being a bit difficult sometimes, is to say that I was an awkward demographic. And I've held on to that. And that's where the blog's name came from. Okay. Some of the things that I found out once I'd had my diagnosis was some of the sort of basics, I suppose, that if you get a very early diagnosis, you grow up and you find ways to deal with them. And I'd never had that opportunity knowing what they were, because they were weird things that I did. So I'm going to talk about things like stimming, for example. And for me, I'd grown up learning to sit on my hands if I was in public, and I started to get really anxious because my instinct was to do this with my fingers, and I press them together really hard, and I'm counting, and I'll count in my head, and sometimes I close my eyes because it's the only way I can shut everything out is by focusing and concentrating on something. And what I'd ended up doing over the years was, instead of pushing my fingers together to make sure I can feel something that pulls me away from all the distractions, was dig my nails into my hands, and actually at times cause some quite unpleasant sort of welts across my hands from doing it so much. And learning about these things, or sitting on them and stopping myself from doing it, and just that kind of tension building up, you know, to know that that is something that's actually quite common amongst people who are autistic. There's all different kinds of ways that people stim, and some people use objects to stim with, and I've done that a little bit sometimes. I've got some putties that are quite good for doing that with, so I don't end up pressing my hands together. But knowing that those things are kind of part of the way my brain works and not just something that I'm doing that's a bit weird that people need to stare at is kind of useful in itself. Another thing is this notion of masking, and masking is where you change the way you behave to fit in with what is normal, whatever that might be. And I know none of us really know what normal is, but there are certainly kind of rules, I guess, that society has made up that we follow to some extent, or we try to follow if we don't know what those rules are. And the problem with most rules in the neurotypical world is that they're unwritten. They're just things that people instinctively learn, unless you happen to be autistic and you don't learn them. And this is, I have to say, this is just my story. I can't speak for all autistic people. When you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. You know, none of us are the same. There's somebody that I work with who's autistic, and we are really different in so many ways. There's hardly anything about the way our autism is for us that is the same, except for that we're both terrible with jokes. We're both the worst ever, but we do love a good pun. Puns are good because they're really easy to understand. But other than that, we're so vastly different. And I think it's really important to keep that in mind, because it kind of affects some of the things I'm going to talk about in a minute around what autism looks like, I guess. The thing about masking, and I know I've been doing this all my life because I've used it in a way to kind of reinvent myself several times when I've moved to different places or to different jobs, because I've tried to fit in, is that you can do it for a certain amount of time, and then you either can't keep it up, or people have sussed out that that's not actually really who you are. And it's very exhausting. Even though now that I'm very open and out about being autistic, I still do it. And I do it partly because it protects me a little bit. It makes me feel a little bit less vulnerable. It makes me feel less like people are going to just kind of point the finger and go, oh, that's because she's autistic. That's why she's doing that. Because I don't want people to do that. I want people to see me for who I am. Being autistic is part of who I am, but it's not all of it. I know for some people it's really top of the list of important things about who they are, but there's so many things that I am, and I don't want to become just one of those things. But for me, I think being autistic makes me special, you know? There's not as many of us as there are of other people, so that's a good thing for starters. But I also know, in terms of being autistic, I'm incredibly lucky because it's such a small percentage of us that can hold down any kind of a job on a permanent basis, you know, and it shouldn't be like that. There should be so many more opportunities for people. And part of that depends on how good you are at doing things like masking, about being able to fit in and understand what those kind of rules are around things. And they're things that most people don't even think about, like, you know, when you walk into the office and you say good morning and you have a little bit of social chit chat with people. And, you know, for me, that's my idea of hell. I just want to go in and get started and work. You know, if somebody says to me, how are you? You could find yourself stuck with me for a good 20 minutes, half an hour before I realized that you just wanted me to go, yeah, I'm fine, thank you, and move on. Because I don't always remember that. And all these things about kind of stimming and masking and the hypersensitivity to lights and sounds and smells, they're not the same every day. You know, they're really affected by a number of things in the environment and a number of things that maybe have been happening to me over a period of time. So there may be one day where I can, for example, walk into the office, and the fact that the lights are all on and fairly bright, I can relatively deal with that. It's not that big of a deal. But if I've already been massively overstimulated, and for whatever reason, I'm already kind of quite worked up about a lot of things, I can walk into that, and that can be the final thing for me. That can be the thing that tips me right over the edge, is just having to deal with too many bright lights. So it's not an everyday thing. Somebody said to me once when we were talking, this was quite recently, maybe just over a year ago, they said, oh, you know, I'm sorry, I didn't know you were autistic because I've never seen you have a meltdown. It's like, that is why should you? Why should you expect to see me have a meltdown? You know, I'm at work and I'm a professional, and if I feel like, you know, I'm having that much of a bad day, I will take myself out of the situation. But to not think that I could possibly be autistic because you haven't seen that happen, you know, you wouldn't say to somebody who couldn't see, oh, I didn't know you were blind because I've never seen you fall over the staircase, or, you know, you wouldn't say to somebody anyway. So yeah. Right, rambly me. The next thing I wanted to talk about is people's responses, because I suppose that affirmation from both the person that assessed me and the clinical psychologist and the speech and language therapist was good for me, because they were professionals, so they had like certificates to say that they could tell me this. But what's really interesting are the number of unqualified professionals out there, i.e. everybody else in the whole entire world, who can tell you all the reasons why you're not autistic, because you're not autistic because I've never seen you have a meltdown. You're not autistic because you have a job. You're not autistic because I've got a friend with an autistic child and you're not like them. You know, that you're not autistic because this is just the way you are, and everybody's like that. Oh, and everyone's a little bit autistic as well. That's quite a hard one to swallow sometimes, to be fair. It's interesting. It's interesting when people say that, as if actually it should really bother me whether they believe that I'm autistic or not. I know that there are people within my family who don't believe that I'm autistic. I know there are people that I work with who don't believe that I'm autistic. There are people all over the place who don't. And for some of them, it's because, like I said at the beginning, I didn't look like what I believed autistic people should look like. I don't to them. So how could I possibly be autistic? And for some of them, it just suits them not to believe that there was any other reason for the way I was. And therefore, if they do believe that I'm autistic, then the way that they've treated me hasn't been necessarily very good over the years. So it suits them better to believe that I'm not. It doesn't matter to me really if people don't want to believe if I'm autistic or not, because I am. And I'm not sharing my report with anybody because it has a whole load of other stuff in it that's really personal that I don't think anybody needs to see. What matters mostly for me is that those people that have been doing it for a long time told me that I am. And it's allowed me to kind of make a lot of changes in my life. And one of those changes was being really open about it. It was the disclosure. It was talking to people at home first about it, and then a couple of months later, starting to talk to people at work about it. And I did do it in phases. I didn't just do a great big ta-da, because I didn't know how people would take it. I didn't know what the responses would be. And I didn't tell them because I wanted any kind of sympathy. I don't want sympathy. I think being autistic is bloody brilliant. And, you know, I think my empathy in terms of compassionate and effective empathy is a superpower. So I'm cool with that. But I did hope that it would help people understand how we could work together better. So not that it all had to be one-sided from other people, but that we could look at the things that sometimes I find a bit more problematic and find better ways to work with each other, because I know I've got a lot to offer. And I know there are other autistic people out there who aren't working, who have so much to offer, but they're not going to get that chance because they don't fit people's perceptions of what you should look like to work in an office or as part of this team or that team or in this environment or that environment. And I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done about that. The person in my team who works with me, who is also autistic, just has the most, they're brilliant. They have the most amazing skills around things that I have absolutely no knowledge of, things like spreadsheets, and they know science stuff, and they bring so much to my team that only they could bring. And I think, wow, imagine missing out just because you weren't prepared to adapt the way that you conduct your interviews to bring new employees in to get the best out of everyone that's out there. And so I think being autistic is great. And I don't think for one moment, you know, what other people think was important from that perspective. But sharing the diagnosis, I guess, and further down the line, I did share a disclosure document that I created about what works well for me and what doesn't work so well for me. And all of this is on my blog. It's not a private thing. I thought that those things would help with some reasonable adjustments around working in an open plan office, which is probably the kind of seventh circle of hell for most people who are autistic in terms of a workplace. One of the really difficult things, I suppose, it's hard because sometimes, because being autistic is invisible, and also because I have mental health issues that I think kind of sit alongside it, they're all kind of invisible. And I think when you have these conditions that can't be seen, people forget about them sometimes. And that's human nature. We all forget things sometimes. It's not easy when you feel like you're constantly having to remind people there's a reason why I need to sit by the windows. It's not because I want to be the only person with a beautiful window view. It's because natural light means that my head feels less like there's a million and one things closing in on it. There's a reason why I have to keep asking everyone to mute themselves in Zoom meetings, because when I've got my headphones in for them, I hear every single noise, I hear people breathing, I hear people doing things they don't even know that they're doing. So, and I think when a disability is less visible, it's much easier for people to forget about it. So I think that can be hard sometimes. I think that can be a tricky one to deal with. The last thing I wrote on my little list of things to kind of talk about a bit was what happened when lockdown came. And on my blog, the first post I really wrote about this was this idea of it being the world turning upside down. And it was a funny thing, almost funny haha in some ways, but you're not allowed to laugh at discomfort. So I'm not going to laugh at all the neurotypical people who couldn't cope with being at home in the peace and quiet without all the lights on for a few weeks. And for a few weeks, I loved it. I loved not having to walk into the office in the morning. In fact, the first hour in the office is, I always love it because I'm the only person in, but I love not being in the office as it fills up with people who start talking about things that aren't work related and making noise around me. And they bring the smells in with them that they bring, even if they don't know it. And all the noise and the lights coming on and all those things. I loved having that control of my environment, and it seemed like the perfect working environment to me. And after a couple of weeks, we'd be having Zoom meetings with work people, and they'd be like, I hate this, I hate being on my own all the time, like I need to be around people, I'm missing all this stuff. And I said, you're now living in the kind of reverse of my world. It's like my world has flipped, and this way that we're living now is almost perfect for me, because it's taken out all the things that are in that normal world that I struggle to deal with around all the hypersensitivity issues that I have. And people are like, well, I could never do that. But then things changed a little bit for me as well, I have to say. You know, I got a few months in, and what I actually realized was that despite the fact that I've stuck to my routine as much as I can possibly do, so I still get up for work every day at the same time and walk the dog and have my breakfast and then start work, not having that walk into work and walk into my actual space in the office where my actual desk has been for the last however many years, and all those parts of my routine, having that taken away became really difficult for me. So it was almost like I was experiencing a little bit of what other people had experienced right at the beginning. And that was I mean, that was interesting for me in itself. It was, I suppose I was having to challenge myself a little bit about the assumptions that I've made about what I need to function on a daily basis. And it turns out that I do need a little bit of those other interactions, but I need them on my terms. And the lovely thing about when we were finally allowed to go back in the office for a very few short weeks, it was only with a really small number of people who turned out I was probably the noisiest one of them and caused the most yakking, and probably brought the smelly food in and did all the things that in general I can't stand other people doing. But I suppose it's about finding that balance and yeah, how you deal with those things. So yeah, that was kind of how lockdown was. But I kind of want to put a plea out there to everybody to remember, when things return to some kind of semblance of normality, to remember what it was like those first few weeks when people were sort of feeling really panicky about being at home on their own and all those things, because I quite often feel like that about being out in the office and in the real world. And I'd ask that those people kind of try and hang on to a little bit of that and be a little bit kinder in their responses to some of the needs that autistic people might have around particularly environments out there in the real world. And you might not see it on our faces, but if you are, we'll definitely be smiling on the inside, if not on the outside. So yeah. I do feel a lot like I've got this kind of weird imposter syndrome. It felt a really weird thing when I was asked to come and talk about the blog that I'd been writing and talk to people and share it with people. It is the only thing that I kind of am an expert on, is me. So I should know what I'm talking about. I don't know how much of anything that I've said makes any sense whatsoever, or in fact, even if anybody's still awake behind those little windows that I'm looking at. But I think, yeah, maybe now's the time to see if there are any questions about that. Thank you, Mac. You're wonderful. You put up with all my yakking in the office on those days and then went and disappeared into a little room so that I didn't have to put up with being in a room with lots of people. So wonderful person, but thank you.